Welcome to this fun watercolour tutorial where I actually paint from my imagination using lots of yummy techniques. Let's get started. For a full list of all the materials I'm using, colours and alternative colours can be found in the description below. So the drawing is very simple. I'm drawing a horizon line about a third up from the bottom and some very small squiggly trees, and I'm using an HB pencil on cold press watercolour paper. So I am mixing up some cobalt blue here with my size 8 round brush. So I'm going to paint the sky first. So always make sure you've got plenty of paint. I'm also adding some cerulean to this, but you can stick to the cobalt blue. And for colour alternatives, please see the description below. So I'm mixing up here some Winsor Red, very, very dilute, with some of the cobalt blue, about 50-50. And I'm also mixing up some raw sienna, again very dilute. And the Winsor Red and Cobalt Blue is going to be for the shadows of the clouds. So I'm wetting the paper down to the horizon with my 1-inch flat, soft-haired brush. So I'm painting the clouds first using my size 6 round brush. So bigger clouds, sort of top end of the sky, and paint smaller clouds at the bottom end of the sky towards the horizon, wet into wet. So I'm just sort of applying these smaller ones as I go towards the horizon. Mixing up a slightly thicker shadow colour here, that's the cobalt blue with the Winsor Red. And I'm just painting a slightly darker shadow of the clouds just underneath. And I'm going to apply a little bit of the raw sienna and push it into the clouds to have some lighter, sort of softer, warmer colours to the right hand side here and there. Loading my brush with the cobalt blue, I'm painting wet into wet, starting at the top of the sky. And I'm leaving a gap between the shadow of the clouds and the blue sky. So that'll be the light at the top of the clouds there. If your paint runs too much, don't worry, I'll show you how to resolve that a little bit later. I'm working my way down here, painting the gaps here, the negative space really. Now it's becoming a positive space because I'm painting the sky with the blue, and I'm paling that colour as I go towards the horizon, adding a little bit more water. Still working wet into wet. You notice the clouds become smaller and it looks like they're much further away, and this will create depth in your painting. I'm using a damp paper towel to lift off the clouds. I find this better than using a dry paper towel. I find it lifts off too much paint and creates sort of marks that you sort of not prepared for in a way. This is more subtle and you have more control. So wet the paper towel and wring out the excess water, and then use it to lift off the wet or damp paint. And you can see that it creates a really subtle effect. And I'm just working my way down towards the horizon. Again, smaller marks as you go towards the horizon. I'm mixing up some raw sienna and cobalt blue to make a sort of a cool green colour, so it won't come forwards. They look like distant trees. I'm painting damp into damp along the horizon line. There's small marks here using my size 6 round brush. Rinsing my brush, I'm now mixing up a little bit of yellow with a pinch of cerulean to make a yellow green. It's a little bit creamier, and I'm just painting slightly bigger trees sort of on top of that grey blue colour. And these are going to come forward a little bit, so they're going to look in front of those distant trees. Mixed up a little bit more cerulean to get a more mid-green colour, painting damp into damp, sort of even in front of those yellow-green trees. Mixed up a tiny bit of Paynes grey now, the paint slightly thicker. Using the tip of my brush, I'm painting damp into damp along the horizon line, so it's slightly darker here, and it kind of grounds the trees as well. And I'm just making some smaller marks. They look like distant bushes as well. I've mixed up a pinch of burnt sienna into that burnt sienna and yellow, and just painting some more darker marks, damp into damp, again looking like sort of distant bushes there along the horizon. I'm using a cocktail stick and I'm scratching into the damp paper. So this is permanent, but it kind of looks like tree trunks and branches sort of further away there. I'm also pulling up the paint as well, so it's quite effective. Mixing up here raw sienna and yellow, working wet on dry, using my size 6 brush, working up to that horizon line. Don't worry if it runs a little bit, it kind of looks more natural that way. This is a little bit of quinacridone gold. If you don't have that, don't worry, you could use the raw sienna. I'm using a little bit more dark now, running it along that horizon line with the tip of my size 6 brush, and it's damp into damp, and I'm hoping that'll run into the yellow a little bit, so it kind of creates soft, distant grasses there. Using a little bit more of a yellow green there, yellow with a pinch of blue, working my way down now from the middle ground to the foreground. I've added a touch more cerulean and I'm sort of working my way down, wet on dry, but as you can see the top part is wet in wet as it runs into the colour above. And now I'm adding the Paynes grey and a bit of cobalt blue into that yellow to make a darker green in the foreground. So you've really got sort of dark, mid and light tonal values there as it goes off into the distance to create depth in the painting. I'm painting damp into damp here, a mid-tone green. That's the cobalt blue with the yellow. And it's just to sort of look like grasses in the middle ground and going off into the distance using the tip of my brush just to create a little bit more texture and detail. So adding a little bit more of Paynes grey to that cobalt blue and yellow, and I'm going to paint some grasses now, damp into damp in the foreground, just to create that depth and sort of paint sort of larger grasses and then smaller ones in the distance there, damp into damp, still using the size 6 brush. And now I'm using that cocktail stick to kind of lift off some of the paint to create lighter grasses. And now I'm using some table salt and I'm going to sprinkle that onto the damp surface. And what that will do, it'll absorb the paint to create light textures once dry. An alternative to salt is spattering just clean water. I'm doing this in the foreground and it will create a similar effect to the salt. And I'm actually spattering the water into the middle ground as well. Mixing up some Paynes grey here with my size 4 round brush, and I'm painting pretty much wet on dry. I've just added a pinch more of burnt sienna there, and I just want to paint some distant sort of tree trunks and branches using this dark colour, and it pretty much has dried off. If it's a bit too damp, wait for your painting to dry naturally in this case, because you want to allow the salt to work and that water spatter. But it just adds a little bit of detail and brings some of those trees a little bit forward and pushes the others further back. So just adding a few more darks and details here along the horizon line. I'm using the middle of my brush, not the tip, to create texture. You can use a sponge to do this as well, and it's just a mid-green, the cobalt blue and the yellow, and I haven't put a lot of water into that mix, so it's kind of a dry brush side brush or dry brush belly brush sort of technique here, and it creates the look of foliage. So you, as I say, you can use a sponge to do this, but it's quite effective to use the belly of the brush or the middle of the brush as well, and try to do that on the side. And I'm actually doing the same in the bushes in the sort of along the horizon line there, again to create texture. So I'm really adding lots of details here to those trees. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to mix up some of the Winsor Red. You can use cadmium red, and it's a creamy mix, and I'm just spattering it on to the wet or damp surface there, and I'm using my hand to protect the sky, but you may want to use a paper towel to do this. And what happens when you sort of spatter onto a wet surface, you can see the paint starts to spread and move. And I wanted to do that to create a more natural looking effect. I'm just using the paper towel just to lift off some of the spatters that kind of went astray and just to control some of those marks there. I'm just using a dark green here. It's quite creamy, Paynes grey, cobalt blue and the yellow, and I'm painting damp into damp in the foreground using my size 4 round brush, so just some darker grasses, and this creates depth in the painting because these darks will come forward. And sometimes you get little spots in the sky from the spattering. So what I'm doing here is I'm just using a sort of dark grey green, Paynes grey and raw sienna, and just painting little V shapes so they look like birds in the distance. But I find the little spots are a good place to cover up, and it's quite random, so you can actually paint some little birds in the sky. What I'm doing now is I'm covering the sky and I'm just spattering some limey green, that's cerulean and yellow, just around the poppy area there, just so it looks like grasses and poppy seed heads, etc. And I'm going to allow the painting to dry naturally to allow the salt to work. I've brushed off the salt and I'm painting wet on dry with my size 4 brush using the Winsor Red. And I'm just sort of painting some bigger poppies in the foreground, a few stars of the show, just to kind of bring them forward a little bit, and again to create depth in my painting. And as I go towards the horizon, the poppies will get smaller. I've mixed up a mid-green, the cobalt blue with the yellow. I'm using my reservoir brush, and you can use a rigger or even a twig to paint wet on dry some stems for the main poppies in the foreground and a few little seed heads as well. I've decided to make some of the poppies a little bit bigger. Just this one in the centre here, just to make it look more star of the show. So just picking a few supporting cast members here, and it kind of really does create depth in the painting. Using Paynes grey literally from the tube here, so it's really damp into damp, and painting darks in the centre of the poppies. I decided to add a few bigger trees along the horizon here. So this tree on the right, I'm just making slightly bigger, adding a bit more of a mid-green there, and that's the cobalt blue with the yellow with a pinch of Paynes grey, and just adding a few more details to the foliage of the trees in the middle and on the left. I'm adding a few more darks here using the Paynes grey with a pinch of that green, and just adding a little bit on the horizon line itself using the belly of my brush wet on dry. I'm masking out the sky and the trees, and I'm spattering a little bit of that limey green, that's the yellow, with a little bit of the cerulean wet on dry. I've added some white to that colour, and I'm spattering the white wet on dry, or in some areas a little bit wet into wet, to create light and texture. I've removed the paper towel. I'm just sort of adding to those birds that I painted earlier, sort of bringing out a few, making them slightly darker just here and there to finish off my painting. And I'm just removing the washi tape now, which reveals a really nice border, and it's a great way of presenting your work, especially in a sketchbook. So here is the finished painting. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial and that it inspires you to paint something similar from your imagination. If you like the content that I create here on YouTube and you'd like to get access to my weekly exclusive tutorials, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about the membership can be found in the description below. Just click Patreon. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.